Hello students, this is Mr. Russell here in the biology layer, also known as the prep room behind my classroom. And I'm here today to talk about cellular respiration. Last class we talked about ATP and how this molecule is used for energy. It has 3 phosphates attached to it, and we break one of those phosphates off, and that releases energy that your cells can use for all different kinds of stuff. When you break it off, you end up with this ADP, 2 phosphates, that's di, okay, and then a free phosphate and energy that we can use. Okay, well today we're going to talk about how we get more ATP, and that's cellular respiration. Okay, so cellular respiration is actually a series of metabolic reactions that convert energy from sugars into ATP. We talked about metabolism back when we talked about the criteria for life, and that's many different chemical reactions happening in your cells all the time that help keep you alive. Okay, this is one very important one because this is how our cells get that ATP. The example I like to use is that ATP is kind of like electricity in your house. You plug all kinds of stuff into the wall and get power for them to work on. Dozens of different things, I'm sure. But that electricity's got to come from a different form. In Missouri, it's usually coal is where we get that energy from, but it has to get converted into a usable form, and that is electricity. In a cell, that usable form is ATP. Okay, so this happens in the cells, and it happens mostly in the mitochondria. Here you have a little cartoon picture of one, and you also have a micrograph, meaning a picture taken with a microscope of one. You do have a little bit of cell respiration that occurs out in the cytoplasm of the cell, but that's a small percentage of all of the ATP that the cell actually uses. The vast majority happens in the mitochondria, and it happens along these little surfaces of this inner membrane. So the reason it's all folded up in there like it is that allows more surface area for these reactions to take place. So that's why we call the mitochondria the power plant of the cell, because that's where most of your ATP is made, and that provides energy for dozens or hundreds of different cellular reactions. Okay, let's do a little overview of the entire process of cellular respiration before we break it down into smaller parts. Okay, cellular respiration is usually the breakdown of glucose. That's your body's most common source of energy. It's carbohydrates, what starch is made out of. You get a lot of it from grains and from starchy foods like pasta, which comes from a grain, and also potatoes and things like that. It is your cell's primary source of information. It's a carbohydrate, if you've heard that term before. Okay, it is broken down through a process called glycolysis. Glyco refers to glucose, and lysis refers to separating or breaking, so it's breaking glucose down. This happens out in the cytoplasm. As I said before, a small amount of your ATP comes from reactions out in the cytoplasm, though the vast majority of it comes from the mitochondria. This first part is what happens out in the cytoplasm. You can see that here, glucose broken down by glycolysis, and we get 2 ATP out of that, so just a little bit. Okay, after that, pyruvate, this substance, is created. Okay, and you don't really need to know a lot about pyruvate except that that's what we get from glycolysis. Now, it can go down 2 processes. It can go to fermentation if there is not any oxygen present. That's called anaerobic respiration. And if there is oxygen present, it goes through these other series of cycles. It's called aerobic respiration, where you get a lot more ATP. So we're going to talk more about that. So the important thing to understand here, though, is that after glycolysis, which is always the first step, you either go through anaerobic or aerobic respiration. Okay, I want to go over a little bit of the chemistry, just a little bit. This is a chemical formula that shows you cellular respiration, or anaerobic respiration, I should say. You see, we start out with glucose, and your cells also need oxygen. This is why you actually have to breathe. You are taking in oxygen to use for aerobic respiration. And then various enzymes break those down, and we get these things. Our byproducts are carbon dioxide, which is what you exhale, you get rid of, okay, and then water, and you don't think about this, but you actually release a lot of water through your exhaling. If you've ever exhaled on like a cold window or something like that, and you get some condensation on it, that's the water vapor. That's water in a gas form that's coming out through your breath, and that's because of cellular respiration. And also the main goal here, our primary product, is ATP, which your cells use for all kinds of stuff. Okay, down below it shows you the same thing. except it gives you the chemical formulas instead of just the names. This is big and scary, but all this is glucose, and it's made out of 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. All right, so that combines with 6 oxygen molecules. Oxygen, whenever it finds other oxygen atoms in the atmosphere, they stick together, they pair up. So you never find just one oxygen hanging out. It's always in pairs, which is why this is O2. So 6 of those O2s for 12 total. All right, and then we get out of it 6 carbon dioxides and then 6 water molecules plus the ATP that we use, but that goes somewhere else and gets used by the cells. These things are waste products that have to be recycled or gotten rid of, which is why you exhale the carbon dioxide and also some water, though you do use a lot of what you produce. All right. Okay. Aerobic respiration, a little more detail. This happens in the presence of oxygen. Like I said, this is why you have to breathe. If you stop breathing, your cells will cease to function because they are not getting the oxygen they need in order to go through this process, aerobic respiration. Okay, what you need to get out of this is that we need oxygen for aerobic respiration, and it is a lot more efficient. You get more ATP out of it. You also don't get any harmful byproducts, which we're going to find out about anaerobic respiration, actually. I'm sorry. Anaerobic respiration gives you harmful byproducts, which we'll talk about now. Okay, anaerobic respiration is what happens when you don't have enough oxygen, okay? Your cells don't want to do this. They only do it if they have to. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 different kinds of fermentation. The first kind is the one you do. That's lactic acid fermentation. Let me back up real quick. So you see, without oxygen, we go to fermentation, which can be one of 2 things. Lactic acid fermentation is what humans do, and this gives us a byproduct of lactate or lactic acid, and this is what makes your muscles burn after you've been working out or exerting yourself. Okay, this is why your muscles hurt, and eventually it will cause them to bind up and stop functioning. Sometimes when people do Ironman triathlons or run marathons, even though they don't want to, they will collapse because they have too much lactic acid built up in their muscles, and their muscles just will not contract anymore. And that can be very dangerous. Okay, so lactic acid is a byproduct, and like I said, that's what causes your muscles to burn. And it builds up because you don't have the oxygen necessary. So you go down a totally different metabolic pathway, and that forces your cells to go through this much less efficient process. We only get 2 ATP, and we also produce this harmful byproduct. So instead of the 36 that we would have gotten going through aerobic respiration, we only get 2, which is obviously way less. You don't want to do lactic fermentation, but what it does is it gives you just a little bit more energy to go just a little bit further, which is great as far as a species goes, because maybe that gives you just a little bit more time to run away from a predator, or just a little bit more energy to catch your prey. Okay, like I said, this is what happens in us, and this is what causes muscle burn, and is lactic acid fermentation. Another similar process that doesn't happen to us, but it happens to a lot of microorganisms, is ethanol fermentation. All right, and this is yeast and some, that should say bacteria, but it's behind the bread here. Ethanol fermentation is what we use to make bread and also to brew wine or beer. Okay, the yeast, when they get a hold of the pyruvate, they break it down and get just 2 ATP out of it as well, so still not very efficient, but the byproducts are different. You end up with carbon dioxide and ethanol, which is alcohol. That's what's in beer and wine and liquor, and it's bad for you, remember that. Anyway, so those are the byproducts. In bread, the ethanol all evaporates when you bake the bread, so it's not in there anymore, but the CO2 is what causes the bread to rise, and that's how we get all these little gas pockets inside of it. That's the CO2 produced because the yeast are fermenting the sugars in the bread. Okay, so this is ethanol fermentation. Our byproducts are carbon dioxide and ethanol, and we still only get 2 ATP, much less efficient than aerobic respiration, but we can do it without oxygen. So let's back up to this diagram real quick. We start out with glucose. It goes through glycolysis, glycolysis, breaking of glucose. We get 2 ATP out of that. We then end up with a byproduct, or just a product, pyruvate, which can go 2 different ways. If there's oxygen present, which we hope, then it's going to go through these processes, which overall are called aerobic respiration, and that's going to give us 36 ATP. Or if there's no oxygen present, or not much oxygen present, we go through fermentation, and depending on what species you are, you might go through different versions of that. Either way, you end up with some byproducts that you don't want and have to be gotten rid of. Okay, so that is cellular respiration. I hope that helps.